Welcome to the 13th Annual Griswold Center for Economic Policy Studies Senior Thesis Research Forum. Thank you for tuning into this virtual event. The purpose of the forum is to showcase outstanding economic policy-related research produced by our matriculating seniors in the Department of Economics at Princeton. We would like to thank the selected students for their hard work preparing their presentations and congratulate them on winning the 2024 Griswold Center for Economic Policy Studies Senior Thesis Prize. This year's presenters include Jampel Dorjee. Jampel's thesis analyzes the intergenerational wealth transfer in the British aristocracy from 1860 to 2022, and Jampel's thesis advisor is Damien Vergara. Joe Fast. Joe's thesis focuses on the effect of the minimum wage on disability insurance recipients, and Joe's thesis advisor is Zachary Bleemer. Tucker Saland. Tucker's thesis explores a model calibration approach to green financing, environmental taxes, and climate change, and Tucker's thesis advisor is Natalie Cox and Aaron Ventresca. Aaron's thesis investigates the effect of the Tax Cuts and Job Acts of 2017 on private charitable giving. Aaron's thesis advisor is Hope Carmen. So thank you again for tuning in for this virtual forum, and I hope you enjoy the presentations, and we appreciate your support of undergraduate research.
Hi guys, my name is Jampel, and today I'll be presenting on my senior thesis titled How the Rich Stay Rich, Intergenerational Wealth Transfer in the British Aristocracy, the time period I follows 1860 and 2022. So super high level, my thesis investigates the persistence of wealth within the aristocracy, focusing on the mechanism of the wealth transfer, and how this persists between generations, ultimately with the goal of drawing a commentary on wealth inequality, and to understand the role of government mechanisms in upholding the status quo pertaining to wealth inequality. So to start with a bit of a historical background, the peerage system, as we know it today, began forming around the time of the Norman Conquest when William the Conqueror introduced systems of rewarding his compatriots with land. This evolved over time into hierarchies that we see today, ranging from the titles of Duke, Marquess, Earl, Viscount, and Baron, which ultimately served as a major bedrock for much of Britain's class history. The primary form of wealth was traditionally in the form of agricultural land holdings. Over time, this began shifting, especially with the Industrial Revolution, into the new forms of wealth and wealth transfer and persistence of wealth, which we'll investigate. And just to note, Britain has a unique nobility compared to a lot of its other peers in Europe, which made it especially interesting as a case study. So for data, the data for my thesis came primarily in two forms: first, quantitative and qualitative. So the quantitative data was derived in a lot of different ways. The primary source was a UK probate database, which was compiled by me and two researchers in London through combing basically uk.gov and finding individual probates for individuals. And that was mapped with people, members of the hereditary peerage, to ultimately build this idea of wealth at death of individuals in the hereditary period. And this goes back to 1860, which was very helpful. And then a few other pieces of, databases that I used for bringing measures of wealth up to speed from 1860 and equalizing it to wealth today. I had to adjust everything by the retail price index, which was collected through this paper, O'Donoghue et al. 2004, which was really helpful in having more of the historical inflation data, and then a lot of the research stuff came from Office of National Statistics, where I also received information on things like wealth shares and inheritance tax revenues, etc. And then next, a few of the other ways I was able to contextualize wealth was through other variables such as wheat prices, which was a pretty painstaking process, but I was able to read quarterly London and Edinburgh Gazettes, which published wheat prices from 1860 to 1934, 35, which I I was able to compile into a database, which I was then able to use to compare to the trajectories of aristocratic wealth. So that was the quantitative side, and on the qualitative side, it was a lot of the cases were all collected in person at several archives in London, namely the National Archive, the Westminster City Archive, and I was just using keyword searches to come through the databases and to collect physical documents which pertain to trust funds in the States. And yeah, a lot of interesting stuff there. So I guess high level about my quantitative methodology, I sort of split it up into three different parts. The first part being, is the hereditary period still rich? The second part being how their wealth is unique, and the third part, is this a persistent wealth? And the first part of this analysis was basically done to view its wealth in its current and historical context, so through Morris modeling, and then through the use of several multipliers. So the first multiplier used was viewing the wealth of the hereditary peerage in the context of the bottom 90th percentile, or bottom 90% of British wealth holders. The next was to view it in the context of its population share in context of the national inheritance tax revenue share, and then finally view its percentage share of overall wealth within the top 1% of wealth holders. Next, the idea of sort of viewing its wealth as an aberration was to look at the correlation and trajectories of it with other metrics of wealth more generally. So, like I said, the 90th percentile was something I used a lot, as well as wheat prices, tax rates, to sort of try to isolate the deviation of its own wealth. And then finally, to looking at the probability of occurrence or of appearance in the probate data set going backwards and going forward, so to help draw conclusions on its wealth persistence. And a lot of these conclusions were drawn through the context of a stratified peerage with different ranks, which helped make things a little bit more clear. Like I talked about earlier, the qualitative methodology was primarily to use these physical documents and try to gain insight onto things like government interventions, tax loopholes, inter vivos transfers, ultimately draw conclusions about the wealth persistence and transference. So to start with, here's some select quantitative results. Like I talked about, the Morris analysis on the wealth of the hereditary peerage compared to the wealth of the 90th percentile. So similar trajectories, but there are deviations. I feel like this is a good time to mention that a database collected with probate is far and away likely going to be an underestimation of wealth. So this sort of contextualizes the wealth in the broader context with trajectories, though it's not necessarily accurate in an absolute scale. The next result I'd like to highlight is the share of national inheritance tax revenue paid by the hereditary period. So as you see, the numbers have decreased over time, but just wanted to point out, a few things. So if you see around 2016, there's a huge leap there, which is around 6% of the total national inheritance tax revenue. That came from only the deaths of 8 hereditary peers, which is around a 23,000 time overrepresentation of their population share. So we're talking very significant rates, even though the numbers are decreasing, they're still extreme overrepresentations. So next, talking a little bit about that, I broke down some of the numbers on wealth share as opposed to population share, and how that relates to ultimate proportional multiplier. Essentially, if the number is greater than 1, that means that they hold a disproportionate share of wealth, and clearly it's still true today with these multipliers. And then finally, just a few information like I talked about, breaking down the peerage by rank, which is actually something fairly unique in scholarship about hereditary peerage, but being able to view it in this context helps legitimize and sort of understand that even today, 160 years later, dukes far and away still have more wealth than our classes, earls, viscounts, barons, and this goes basically in order, which is really interesting. And then finally, to use the intergenerational wealth from one to the next, I was able to break down the rate, essentially the probability of if you died within this time period, was the likelihood that your predecessor was in it, and if you also died in a previous uh, time period, was the probability that your successor would be in it. So interesting results, sort of affirming this idea of persistence. And then on the qualitative front, some of the selected findings, for example, in one letter I found from 1934, an official from the Treasury was writing about the finances of the Duke of Wellington. This interesting, he used the phrase, it may be the least embarrassing proposal from the government's point of view. So that to me was kind of like a clear sign of the government's role in upholding these aristocratic estates, especially one as prominent as the Duke of Wellington. And then later, here's a document from the estate of Lord Alfred Kitchener, which talked about the idea of Kitchener's service to the state as a justification for the grant of money. So this is a concept that I ended up explaining as an economy of honor, where the honor of an individual or individual predecessors were used to justify government grants, etc. And ultimately, I guess some of the summaries or in summation of these qualitative findings, this really signify the government's role in upholding the aristocracy. So through grants like tax breaks or the gift of estates like the ones to Duke of Wellington and Earl Haig, and ultimately, like I talked about, the government maintained this economy of honor, where there's a hereditary debt paid to the successors of say a great individual who died. And like I said before, some of the broad policy implications of this are that estate and inheritance tax measures are incomplete in helping to assuage the dominance of the hereditary peerage in the United Kingdom, and that the government itself is even playing a pretty active role in maintaining this system, which ultimately derives itself in the significant inequality that we see today. This commentary on historical privilege really shows the remnants of what seems to be, to many people as an anachronism, having lords and etc. But these historical privileges are deeply rooted, and not only are they deeply rooted, but they're upheld by the government, which is something that's certainly interesting. Thank you, and yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed.
Hi everyone, my name is Joe Fast, and my thesis was about the effect of the minimum wage on disability insurance recipients. So a little bit of background and motivation. I focused on the Social Security Disability Insurance Program, SSDI for short, which is the largest disability insurance provider in the US, about 80% of recipients. And in this program, recipients receive a monthly benefit based on their working history. So economists have identified some problems with SSDI or disability insurance programs in general. And one of the key problems is that the number of SSDI recipients fluctuates with unemployment and other indicators of the economy. So this means that there's people that might otherwise work or can work or want to work, which won't when the economy is doing poorly. And governments have tried to rectify this problem by instituting DI return to work policies, but these policies are often ineffective and also expensive. And these problems with SSDI allow policymakers to attack disability insurance programs when they are important and integral parts of the economy and decency. So my research question was, are there more effective policies to encourage DI recipients to work? And so my idea was the minimum wage. And even though in a perfect competition model of the labor market, we would expect an increase in the minimum wage to decrease employment and presumably have more people on SSDI, I recognize the fact that the economics literature over the past 20 years has shown that perhaps a monopsony model of the labor market is more realistic, especially for low-wage labor markets. So in this model, which is pictured here, due to employer market power, they can set the wage at W3. And in a hypothetical minimum wage to W1 would actually increase employment from E2 to E1. And my hypothesis is that some of that increase in employment will come from people on disability insurance. So the data and methodology I used. All the minimum wage data was taken from the paper, The Effect of the Minimum Wage on Low-Wage Jobs by Senges et al. And all my data from the Social Security, so about the SSDI program, is from the master beneficiary file and the annual award and termination transaction file. The methodology I used was an event study difference and differences, which is a very common and well-used methodology in economics. And I actually did 3 different models of event studies for robustness in my results. Model 1 was very similar, almost exactly the same to the model that was used in the effect of the minimum wage on low-wage jobs in this paper. Model 2 was a completely simple standard event study design. And Model 3 was one where instead of using all the minimum wage changes in a given state, just using the first minimum wage change in a given state during my 2002 to 2016 time period. And the reason for doing this is because there's no good or accepted way of dealing with multiple events in an event study design. So some basic summary statistics just to give the landscape. This is from 2002 to 2016, and the average minimum wage in 2016 dollars was $7.47. The total number of the percent of SSDI recipients in relation to the population was 3.3%, so around 3.3% of the population on SSDI, and in any given year, 0.38% of the population applied to SSDI. The average worker benefit, so the average monthly amount you'd earn on SSDI, would be $1,247. And notice that the standard deviation relative to the mean for mostly the min wage and the worker benefit is quite high. So there's a lot of variation between states and in years. So in order for my analysis to work at all, it must be the case that the minimum wage changes are large and have an effect. This is like the whole mechanism for my project. So it's important that this is robust and strong results. And what we see is that, yes, they are. So 1 year after a minimum wage increase, the minimum wage in that given state is 12.4% higher than before the increase, and this is relative to other states. So this correlates to a 0.85 cent increase the first year, 67 cents the second year, declining to a 36-cent increase in the 5th and final year that I included. And then I didn't include any years after because the bite of the minimum wage, how much stronger that minimum wage than the given state, decreases a lot after the 5th year. So this is it. This is the result that I was interested in. And so to interpret this graph, these are the 2 years before the minimum wage change. This is the year of the minimum wage change, and these are all the after years. And on the y-axis, we have the percent of population receiving SSDI. So my hypothesis with all these dots would be lower than 0. There'd be a decline in the percent of the population receiving SSDI. And what we see is that there are negative. There are less people are on SSDI after a minimum wage change, but these blue bars here are confidence intervals, and they show that these results are not statistically significant. So I cannot say that with 95% confidence. And this translates to these percentage point changes translate to a 1.8 to 4.5% decrease in SSDI recipients. And also we report an SSDI elasticity of 0.159. So this is to say, if the minimum wage increases by 100%, if it doubles, there'll be a 15.9% decrease in the number of people on SSDI. Interestingly, one actually significant result we got was with SSDI applications. And it was model 3, the strongest, that showed the strongest results for this, but all models showed a significant decrease in the number of applications. And they showed that due to a minimum wage increase, the number of applications decreased anywhere from 6.1 to 21.5%, actually. So this is the graph of model 3, and we can see after this minimum wage change, there's a decrease in the number of applications. But as we saw on the previous slide, the number of recipients did not change by this much. So we see also in tandem with this decrease in applications, we see an increase in the percent of approved applications, and they increase significantly after minimum wage, which is expected. So one thing to do to prove that my results, to prove some validity, hopefully, to my results, is that in my analysis so far, I've been looking at SSDI recipients that are disabled workers. So people that will be affected by the minimum wage because they could go, their outside option of earning is, it might be higher now due to the minimum wage change compared to being on SSDI. But one group of SSDI recipients that this is not true for is widows, because widows of disabled workers can earn as much as they like on SSDI, and there isn't some maximum amount they can earn before having to leave the program. So they should not be affected by the minimum wage at all. And so I ran the two regressions, restricting the sample to each group of people. And as we can see, this is the graph we've already seen, the small but consistent decreases for disabled workers, but for widows, there's no effect at all. So in conclusion, even though there's no big significant results that I find in my paper, there are some policy implications. So number one, even though we do not find a decrease in SSDI recipients, we don't find an increase as well. And so we can say with 95% confidence that a minimum wage change will result in somewhere in between a -13 to positive 6.5% change in SSDI recipients. And this provides some evidence against a model of perfect competition in the labor market, as if we were in a perfect model, we'd expect employment to go down and most likely SSDI recipients to go up. And this is not the case. For future research, one thing I did not take into account, or did not take into account in my model specifically, was the problem of substantial gainful amount. So this is the amount that someone can earn while still receiving their SSDI benefits. And I only looked at the magnitudes of the minimum wage changes, but one interesting thing someone else could look at, it was how much more your earning power would be working full-time outside of SSDI compared to what it would be inside the program. So that's an interesting area of future research. Another thing would just be more data for longer time periods. And this is because you could see in my graphs, the 95% confidence intervals for each year were quite large. And if we have more data, the results will just be more precise. Number three is looking at SSDI wage elasticities, and specifically within SSDI. There's a large literature on the effect of the minimum wage on workers in general, but a much smaller literature on the effect of the minimum wage on workers within a disability insurance program. And there might be big differences in the effect of the minimum wage on those specific people, and be interesting to know what those are. Lastly, we saw that in the data that there is a pretty significant decrease in the number of applications to SSDI after a minimum wage. So one cool thing to look at could be looking at the characteristics of the pool of applicants after a minimum wage change. Do they change a lot? Are there just less people in general? Like, what kind of people apply less after a minimum wage change? Anyways, thanks for listening. That was my presentation.
Hi, my name is Tucker. I just graduated from Princeton this spring, and I'm excited to share my senior thesis with you. My work is titled Climate Value at Risk, a Monte Carlo approach to simulating climate change. The aim of my project is to 1. Extend an existing climate economy model to account for some recent findings, and 2. Parameterize some key variables in my model and run simulations to understand the implications on both global warming and the economy. I hope this presentation is insightful and that you can take something away from it. Before we get started, I just really quickly want to motivate my project and why it's important. So global warming has the potential to slow economic growth in 2 crucial ways. First, by directly impacting the depreciation of the capital stock, for instance, by increasing the frequency of severe weather events, and 2, by reducing the level of output for a given set of inputs. For example, temperature increases have been shown to reduce hours worked in industries exposed to climate change and have been linked to fatigue and cognitive impairment. So again, global warming has the potential to significantly impact the economy, and that's sort of what I'm looking at in this paper. While numerous structural models have been developed to simulate the possible paths of global warming and its interaction with the economy, none of these models account for two recent findings. One is that the average perceived cost of capital for the greenest firms has fallen to 2.6 percentage points below that of the brownest firms since 2016, concurrent with the rise of sustainable investing and green bonds. In addition, there's been a push to more heavily tax firms for producing pollutants, which has led to a marked rise in green investment. For example, the Environmental Protection Tax Law in China in 2018. So in my paper, I'm effectively extending an existing climate model to try to take into account some of these findings. I also really quickly want to describe some of the climate concerns which serve as the backbone for this paper. Carbon dioxide, which currently accounts for the greatest proportion of warming, has increased to unprecedented levels in recent years, reaching 415 parts per million in 2021. Human-caused climate change is already affecting weather and climate extremes across the globe, which has had adverse effects on food and water security, human health, and the economy. The IPCC projects that under current mitigation strategies, it will be very, very difficult to limit warming to below 2 degrees Celsius, which is the threshold at which experts believe catastrophic climate effects are predicted to occur. So it's very, very important that we learn how to slow climate change, not just for the economy, but also for the environment as well. This all sort of leads into my research question of, in the absence of other more immediate policy interventions, can increased green investment from lower green financing costs and environmental taxes mitigate the long-term economic effects of climate change? So I'm going to be looking at a number of data sets and running simulations in order to try to tackle this question. Really quickly, here's an overview of the DICE model, which is the climate economy model I'm using in my research, developed by Nobel laureate William Nordhaus. So first, capital, labor, and total factor productivity lead to economic output, which is then used for emissions abatement, consumption, which increases utility, and investment. Output creates carbon emissions, which lead to increases in temperature, which then cause climate damages, which reduce further economic output. So again, it's a connected cycle, and the DICE model attempts to capture these dynamics. I extend the base DICE model in 3 key ways. The first way is by subdividing climate damages between direct damages to the capital stock and damages to output for given capital and labor inputs to capture the 2 ways that global warming can affect the economy that we discussed earlier. I also incorporate a stochastic parameter into my damage function to capture the possibility of catastrophic climate damages, similar to Dietz et al. Finally, I explicitly divide capital into green and non-green capital stocks, and investment into green and non-green investment to capture the differential impacts of climate policies and lower green financing costs on these types of capital and investment, which again, the base DICE model does not do. Really quickly, this is how I'm modeling green investment relative to total investment in my model over time. The idea I'm trying to capture is first that when green firms and green projects have lower financing costs, that accelerates the growth of green investment over time, and 2, when there's an environmental tax that incentivizes increased green investment in the current period, and my model effectively captures both of these ideas. The DICE model can be used to derive probability distributions of the present value of global financial assets under climate change. So given an aggregate dividend payment, GDP growth rates, and discount rates, we can find the present value of financial assets, and we can also calculate the value lost, meaning the value lost relative to if there was no climate change. Implicit in these calculations is the assumption that climate damages are not already priced into future dividends, which we attempt to also test in this paper. I won't go very deep into this part of the paper, but here I'm using an index that effectively tracks the sentiment about climate policy risk in the media. And as we can see, it spikes around major news events, so it seems to sort of be accurately sort of capturing some sort of sentiment about climate policy risk. While I'm not going to discuss my full methodology, I use a Fullman-Macbeth 2-step method to find the exposure of different stocks to climate policy risk over time. And what climate policy risk is it's essentially the risk from, say, government intervention, like a carbon tax, as opposed to the physical risk of climate change itself. And what we find is that investors primarily hedge transition risk from climate change rather than the physical risk from climate change itself. And this lends credence to our assumption that climate damages are not priced into future dividends. And this is important because it is one of the assumptions in our model, which we use to derive probability distributions when we run our simulations. In the next part of my research, I look at the environmental protection tax, which, for those who don't know, was a tax law implemented in China in 2018, which significantly increased the taxes paid by companies producing major pollutants in the country. And one aspect of the environmental protection tax that has particular relevance to the trajectory of climate change is its potential to spur green investment. I try to simulate how this green investment can impact the economy in the long run, so I use the environmental protection tax as a sort of quasi-natural experiment and treat firms in high pollution industries as treated, since they're the ones that are primarily affected by the tax. I adopt a difference in difference framework where pollution is a dummy variable for whether a firm belongs to a high pollution industry, and time is a dummy variable that's one after the implementation of the tax. And what I find is that after the implementation of the tax among polluting firms, there is a substantial increase in green investment, and as you can see here, I'm plotting my parallel trends, and there was a substantial increase after the tax. I then parameterized some key uncertainties in the model using both existing parameters in the literature and my own estimates. So in our extended model, the two sort of primary uncertainties are T tilde, which is the increase in green investment among polluting firms after an environmental protection tax, which we calibrated to be approximately 150% using our difference in difference approach, and D tilde, which is the difference in the cost of capital between green and non-green firms, which I calibrated from existing data. I then performed simulations and optimized my extended DICE model. And what I find is that although lower green financing costs and an environmental protection tax can lower climate risk to some extent, in order to substantially reduce the likelihood of catastrophic climate damages, we need to reduce emissions in the present to limit warming to no more than 2 degrees Celsius. So as we can see here on the graphs below, the distribution of the present value of global financial assets under climate change is much higher when we also incorporate an emissions reduction in the present, as shown by the green bars below. Again, our simulations suggest that on average, the long-term financial benefits from reduced climate damages significantly outweigh the increased mitigation costs in the present, and we cannot solely rely on increased green investment to mitigate climate risk, and so it's in the best interest of a risk-neutral investor to limit warming in order to maximize the expected value of their investments, and this is especially true for the risk-averse. So again, to more concretely quantify this, in the worst 1% of scenarios, financial assets are expected to lose over 27% of their value as a result of climate change, even with lower financing costs and an environmental protection tax. And when also incorporating carbon emissions abatement in the present, we can increase the expected present value of financial assets by over 6%. So it's a substantial difference. Just to reiterate, one of the main takeaways from my paper is that although reducing emissions might hurt in the present, the long-run financial benefits far outweigh these short-term mitigation costs. And from a financial perspective, it's in the best interest of investors to want to limit warming in the present. Thank you again for your time. I hope you enjoyed my presentation.
Hi, my name is Aaron Ventresca, and today I will be sharing with you my senior thesis entitled The Effect of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 on Private Charitable Giving. Before I begin, I'd like to give special thanks to my advisor, Dr. Hope Corman, for her support and guidance in my research process, both in this project and on my junior paper. I'd also like to thank Dana for her continued work with the Griswold Center. Before I move into the specifics of my presentation, I'd like to give a brief overview. I will begin with motivation behind my research question, and why I think that this policy is of note. I will move into the data and methodology and conclude with my findings and why they are relevant to future economic policy. In 2017, there was a rewrite to the tax code known as the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Though this tax reform did a number of things, it most notably doubled the standard deduction. As an individual, when you file your taxes, you have the choice of deducting a lump sum above the line, known as a standard deduction, or you have the option of deducting a series of itemized deductions, in which case you're deducting certain allowable expenses as non-taxable income. This tax policy nearly doubled the effect of the standard deduction. As a result, this disincentivized many households from itemizing, and in turn, they would claim the increased standard deduction. As a result, this has caused both policymakers and economists to question, what is the impact of this? Why does this matter? One significant itemized deduction that a lot of households claim is the charitable deduction. In other words, you can deduct charitable expenses, charitable gifts as non-taxable income up to a certain percentage of adjusted gross income. In this paper, I examine the following questions. How does this tax reform change the tax incentive to give for households, given the fact that the standard deduction is much higher? And how does the tax incentive to give vary with household characteristics? How does this vary with individual characteristics such as age, wealth level, income level, educational attainment, or other factors that maybe are more pertinent to tax and tax liability, such as itemization status or donor status? To execute my research, I use data from the Survey Research Center at the University of Michigan. UMich puts out a very well-known study known as the Panel Study of Income Dynamics. The survey is unique in that it's genealogic and a sample design, meaning that children of initial survey respondents have the option to join the survey when they become independent of their parents and have established their own households. This data set is extremely rich, having a multitude of information about health, finances, lifestyle, educational attainment, overall well-being, religiosity, etc. As I mentioned earlier, my dependent variable is the real charitable donations of a household in a particular year. And I model this outcome variable as a function of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act as an indicator when it turns on in 2017. I also include a number of individual controls, such as age, health, religious affiliation, income, number of children, and the like. To model the data, I use two main models. I use a number of others in my paper, but for purposes of this presentation, I will focus on the two central models in my work. The first being a difference in differences with a heterogeneous treatment effect. In this model, I include both time and state fixed effects, denoted gamma sub t and gamma sub s, respectively. The d delta term represents an indicator for the treatment, which turns on in 2017. I also include a robust vector of individual controls in the bolded beta x vector. Finally, I include a unit-specific error term in the epsilon sub I. I also run OLS as a robustness check to verify the specificity and accuracy of my results, in which case alpha sub I is household fixed effects, and the bolded beta x is the same vector of individual controls as mentioned previously. The beta TCJA is another indicator for treatment. When running a diff and diff, it is a unique model in the sense that it gives us causal inference. In other words, we are able to obtain a causal impact of this policy change by using this model. The other unique facet of the diff and diff is that it allows us to differentiate our sample into a treatment group and a control group. And this separation between the treatment and control group allows us to obtain causal inference. In this case, because this is a federal tax policy, finding a treatment and control group is a little bit more difficult because everybody pays taxes, or at least should pay taxes if they're following the law. As a way to find a treatment group, I look at itemization status. I argue that itemizers are differentially affected by the policy and that they experience a reduced tax incentive to give because of the near doubling of the standard deduction as compared to households who never itemize, in which case they always claim the standard deduction, so this law maybe won't affect them as much. I also run the diff and diff looking at donors versus non-donors. Again, I argue that donors are differentially affected by the policy and that they give and are more susceptible to changes in the tax code as compared to a household who never gives. Though the treatment and control groups are not necessarily pure in terms of the specific econometric approach, they serve as very good substitutes and yield more than robust results. Here is a brief table summarizing my results. In my paper, I have a more robust and complete table with the list of controls as well as the results from the other models. But in this table, I show that itemizers experience a decrease in giving of approximately $321, holding all else constant. Note this statistic is highly significant at the 1% level. In contrast, donors, in terms of donors, I don't find a significant treatment effect. This is very telling in the sense that itemizers show a noticeable decrease in giving, while I cannot conclude the same for donors. My proposed explanation is that donors give often from a place of personal motivation. They give because they care about a specific cause. On the flip side, itemizers might give solely because of tax purposes, in the sense that because they give to charity, they can deduct this and they pay less. The tax bill is a little bit lower. Because of this, we see the results in this table in the sense that itemizers experience a reduction in giving, while this is maybe not true of donors who always give from a place of personal motivation and sincerity. Here are graphs depicting my results from the previous slide. The blue line represents the control group and the red line represents the treatment group. The vertical red line represents the intervention of treatment at 2017 when the tax law goes into effect. It's important to note that in the donor design, I do have parallel pre-trends. This is incredibly important because it allows us to satisfy the conditions of diff and diff to obtain causal inference. In the itemization design, however, the pre-trends are not necessarily parallel, though they are similar. I proceed with further analysis, noting that this is a limitation of the model in this context. Moving forward, my work is significant to policymakers in that it might guide future economic policy, specifically tax policy. My work comes at an opportune time because the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act phases out of effect at the end of 2025. After 2025, the tax code reverts to its pre-TCJA levels, pre-2017. I propose the following reform. In the table, I show that households of different filing statuses can deduct certain amounts as a standard deduction. My proposition is that these households can deduct an additional small amount of money above the line to compensate for the reduction in standard deduction. In other words, I note that the change in the tax policy under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act crowded out private donations. In other words, because of the increase in the standard deduction, households gave less because they stopped itemizing. In my proposed reform, households that claim the standard deduction are able to still contribute and deduct a little bit of their charitable gift above the line. Note that this incentivizes giving for households that don't itemize. The specifics of my reform are as follows. For a single filer, they're able to deduct $6,500 in a lump sum deduction plus another $500 above the line. For joint filers, $13,000 in a base deduction and another $1,000 above the line. And for the head of a household, $9,550 plus $750 above the line. Again, my proposed reform accounts for the fact that TCJA crowded out private donations by the reduced tax incentive to give. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I appreciate your time and attention.